It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Marc Scaringi Show. The Marc Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Marc is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Marc Scaringi.
Your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And welcome to my listeners here on WHP 580 and iHeartRadio. If you'd like to listen to prior podcasts of the show, read my biweekly columns on Penn Live, or take a look at some great merchandise, check out our website at themarcscaringishow.com. Welcome to our listeners on the various Facebook pages, including Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live. Don't forget to subscribe to The Marc Scaringi Show on YouTube and follow me on Twitter at Marc Scaringi or on Facebook. Well, today we were going to talk about the Department of Justice Inspector General's report blasting former FBI Director James Comey for multiple violations of official FBI policy and rules, the Federal Records Act, and even his own employment agreement with his leaks and lies. And remember, President Trump has called former FBI Director James Comey the leaker and liar. But my most recent column is out, the one on the New York Times 1619 project, which we discussed. We discussed the project last week, and then I published the column, and the column is published on the Western Journal website and also the American Thinker website. I'm not sure if it's up on Penn Live yet, but apparently it's becoming a highly trending story, according to Trendalizer. The column is one of the most trending news stories on racism today. Plus, my tweets about the column have been they've captured the attention of the creator and leader of the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones. She just tweeted back to me, LOL, and that's either lots of luck or laugh out loud. I'm not too sure. I'm not the most proficient on the whole Twitter social media phenomenon, but nevertheless, we got a response from the creator of the 1619 Project to one of our tweets, putting out the column that I recently wrote and is now published. So we've invited Miss Nicole Hannah-Jones to call in to the Marc Scaringi Show today, and so that we can discuss and debate her 1619 project and my response to it. So the invitation is out there to Ms. Jones in the New York Times via Twitter to call in to the Marc Scaringi Show, 717-540-0580, and let's talk and let's debate the 1619 Project. Ms. Jones has been on just about every liberal news media organization, news show at CNN and MSNBC and on down the list, PBS and others, talking about her 1619 Project. And, of course, getting a very warm reception from the liberal talk show hosts. I have not seen Ms. Jones yet on a conservative media talk show, radio show, or television show. So this could be her first opportunity to discuss her project with someone who actually might point out some of the flaws, or actually might point out some criticisms with the 1619 Project. Is that possible? Are we permitted to do so in America today? A major media company, the New York Times, the publisher of record for the United States of America, according to itself, puts on this massive project, and it generates the attention of the country. But are we allowed to criticize it? Are we allowed to point out problems, concerns that we have with the research, the analysis, the facts, and the conclusions? Well, I certainly am and have, and you can check out the column and tell me what you think. And so I think what we'll do, and hopefully Ms. Nicole Hannah-Jones will take up the invitation, accept the invitation, call in, and so we can have an honest, real discussion about the 1619 project. So I'll give my opening statement today by reading the column to you, and then you can call in and give me your thoughts and comments on the 1619 project. But we're gonna break for commercial as I'm delivering the opening statement, so there'll be a little bit of an interruption. So I'll start now, and then we'll break, and then we'll come back and we'll finish. So here it goes. The New York Times 1619 project is being lauded by the media and many Democrats for what they believe is a long overdue discovery of the hidden truth of America, that it was founded on white racism and the enslavement of blacks, and that even today the belief in white racial supremacy is so endemic to America that it's a part of our national DNA. The project will likely be used to advance policies in Washington, D.C. and throughout the country that purport to remedy this alleged injustice. Democratic presidential candidate and United States Senator Kamala Harris has already called the project a masterpiece. But is it? First, it's hard to take its claims seriously when its creators and contributors are privileged black Americans holding exalted positions in journalism, the media, and academia, owned and controlled largely by whites. For example, the project's creator, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who we've invited to call into the show today, is a black reporter employed by the white-owned New York Times. She holds a 2017 fellowship with the MacArthur Foundation, which was founded and endowed by a white man, where she received a $625,000 no-strings-attached grant. She's doing pretty well as a black woman in what she claims is a white, racist America. And ironically, even though she condemns white America for its alleged systematic discrimination against blacks, she demanded that whites be excluded from contributing to the project. And the editors at the New York Times immediately, unhesitatingly, agreed with her demand. So, the mantra at the New York Times 1619 project is, no whites need apply. Nevertheless, Hannah-Jones has dedicated her career to writing about racial inequality. She had previously stated that whites are as racist today as our forefathers, but that we've adapted over time to cover our racism with a sheen of deniability, and that from Jamestown to today, racial inequality is an intentional act by whites against blacks. So Hannah-Jones came to this project with a particular point of view. I think you can easily figure it out. By reading her prior work, one can quickly and easily surmise the conclusion of the project without reading a word. Third, the major premise of the project is based upon a lie. It claims America was birthed in slavery in 1619 when the first 20 African slaves disembarked at Jamestown. It claims America was not a nation conceived in liberty, as Abraham Lincoln intoned, but instead a white racist state begat through the original sin of slavery. More about the New York Times 1619 project when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Marc Scaringi Show.
Now, more of Marc Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is the place where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And we're reading through the column that I wrote, the 1619 project, published by the New York Times. Not my column. The 1619 project was published by the New York Times. My column published by the Western Journal, The American Thinker, and it's a highly trending column on the topic of racism in America. So I thought we would spend today talking about the 1619 Project, even though we did on the show last week. And also, I've had a communication from the creator of the 1619 Project, the investigative reporter for the New York Times, Miss Nicole Hannah Jones, who has wished me an LOL, which is either lots of luck or laugh out loud. I don't know which. But I've invited her to call into the show and be a guest, and we'll have a discussion and a debate, perhaps, on the 1619 Project. She's appeared on all of the liberal and mainstream media television and radio shows from CNN, MSNBC, and others. But I have not yet seen her appear on a conservative television or radio talk show, and this is her opportunity. We'd love to have her call in 717-540-0580. I'm going through the opening statement today. It's the column, and when I finish that, we'll open up the phone lines. Hopefully, Ms. Jones will call in and we'll have the debate, or my listeners are welcome to call in as well. And I'm talking now about the third major premise of the project is based on a lie. It claims America was birthed in slavery in 1619 when the first 20 African slaves disembarked at Jamestown. It claims America was not a nation conceived in liberty, as Abraham Lincoln once intoned, but instead a white racist state begat through the original sin of slavery. However, Jamestown was founded by a British company over a decade before the introduction of slaves. Its purpose was to search for gold and establish trade to enrich its owners of the company. Its purpose was not to give freedom to anyone. America, which is different from Jamestown, different from the Jamestown colony, America was born in 1776, well over 100 years later, when we declared our independence to free the American people, including blacks, from British rule. Now, even the project's claim that the blacks at Jamestown were enslaved by whites is based upon a half-truth. It states the pirates had stolen the slaves from a Portuguese slave ship that had forcibly taken them from what is now the country of Angola. But these Africans were likely captured and enslaved with considerable assistance from fellow black Africans in Africa. In 1619, the Portuguese allied themselves with the Imbagala, a fierce African tribe that lived by marauding other villages and enslaving other Africans. The Portuguese used the Imbagala to attack, defeat, and enslave the neighboring Ndongo tribe. The Portuguese then sold the enslaved Ndongo to the Americas, and ultimately 20 or so arrived in Jamestown in 1619. Now, the project's creator also writes about when the African slaves disembarked in Jamestown, quote, they were no longer Mbundu or Akan or Fulani, 3 tribes in Africa. These men and women, just a few months earlier, they were free. Yet it's highly unlikely that they had been free. The Mbundu were part of the Ndongo kingdom, which had a large slave population itself. And about a third of the population of the Akan states were slaves or serfs. And by the late 19th century, well after Jamestown, slaves still constituted about 50% of the Fulani Emirate. In African society, which was based upon the caste system, the upper castes did not sell their sons and daughters to the Portuguese. They sold their slaves. So it's highly likely these 20 Africans who disembarked in Jamestown were already slaves in Africa, enslaved by their fellow Africans. And slavery was not introduced to America by whites at Jamestown. The Native American tribes here had a long history of enslaving each other. And once blacks arrived, Native American tribes enslaved them too. And some American blacks owned slaves. In some parts of the South, for example in New Orleans, a greater percentage of free blacks owned slaves than whites. Only a small percentage of whites owned slaves. And slavery was not unique to America. It has existed throughout the world since before recorded history. In 1619, although slavery had been banned from white Europe, it flourished in black Africa. Now, although America abolished slavery over 150 years ago, it still thrives in Africa. Africa has the highest rate of enslavement in the world, with nearly 10 million Africans enslaved today. There are more than 3 times as many people in forced servitude today as were captured and sold during the 350-year span of the transatlantic slave trade. The overwhelming majority is in Africa, and almost none are in America. The truth is, America's short-lived experience with slavery pales in comparison to that which has existed for millennia around the world, and particularly in Africa. Slavery is endemic to Africa and is part of its DNA, not America's. Contrary to what the 1619 Project would have you believe, slavery and racism do not define what America was in 1619 or what it is today. America was born in freedom in 1776 for most, and then born again with a new birth of freedom in 1865 for all. After segregation was ended and the full panoply of civil rights ensured to all black Americans, America has now fulfilled the promise of its original charter, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. God bless America. Well, that's the column. It's generating a good bit of interest across the country today, and it's published in the Western Journal, and you can also find it on the American Thinker. And we've tweeted it out, and we tweeted it out to Nicole Hannah-Jones, the creator and leader of the 1619 Project, and she responded by sending a tweet, lots of luck. We have invited her to call into the show and debate the project, debate my response to it. But if I were a betting man, which I'm not, I would bet she will not call into the show because perhaps she is afraid to have to respond to the actual facts about the founding of America. Perhaps she does not want to be confronted with the truth. She's doing very well appearing on the liberal and mainstream media, television, and radio talk shows in which the interviewers there are welcoming and embracing of her message that America is essentially a slave state, a racist state, and she has not really received any pushback from those media outlets. However, we here at the Marc Scaringi Show, we present the truth, the unvarnished and unbiased truth. It's there in the column. You're welcome to call in and dispute what I have written, if you'd like, to any of my listeners, and certainly to Ms. Nicole Hannah-Jones. And so we're hopeful that she calls in, but perhaps she won't, because I see her there on all of those talk shows, doing very well and promulgating her view of what ails America, and that it is fundamentally racist from its birth. And you're seeing these Democratic presidential candidates, including United States Senator and Democratic Presidential Kamala Harris, referring to the 1619 Project as a masterpiece. And we will shortly see in Washington, D.C., and in state houses across the country, we will shortly see Democratic legislators taking the conclusions of the 1619 Project and turning the conclusions into legislation. And that's how this very, I think, anti-American premise and conclusion of the 1619 Project, that it really at its core is so disdainful of what America was and what America is today. That conclusion, that premise, will be turned into legislation and will kind of fill the sails of the Democratic Party as they move into a presidential nomination contest and then a general election. And if none of us actually push back on the 1619 Project, or if none of us present an alternative view, as Kellyanne Conway, the White House senior advisor, would say, alternative facts, meaning the actual facts and not the false facts that are included in the 1619 Project. If none of us do this, then Ms. Nikole Hannah-Jones and her fellow contributors in the New York Times, they will win. And we will come to know America as a racist slave state to this day. And I don't think that's correct based upon historical fact or reality. And I don't think that's good for America. We'll talk more about this when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Marc Scaringi Show.
Let's get back to the Marc Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We're talking today about the New York Times 1619 Project and its premise and conclusion that America is a racist society that was birthed in racism and slavery. And there is intentional racism across the country today. And it's, of course, whites directed at blacks. And that's the 1619 Project by the New York Times. The creator, Nikole Hannah-Jones, we've invited to appear as a guest on our show here today. We have exchanged a tweet with her, invited her, but I assume she will not take up our offer because she doesn't want to subject her work to just the slightest of criticism, or at least an alternative view, in my view, the correct view of the historical facts of the founding of America. So we'll open up the phone lines and we'll keep them open so that Ms. Jones can get through if she'd like. But in the meantime, we'll talk with Ellen from Hanover. You're on the Marc Scaringi Show.
Mark.
Yes, Ellen. Go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to point out that the way the Declaration of Independence was written, the first proposal was we're entitled to life, liberty, and property. But then that was changed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness because the signers knew they would have to deal with the slavery issue at some point. But they also knew that if they tried to deal with it then, they would never get the new republic established. So in terms of racism, I think a fair amount of the population, the non-black population of this country, are getting kind of tired of this continuing beating of the slavery drum. But I think.
Well, I'll tell you, Ellen, I agree with you. I think you're right on target there. I wasn't even going to do this show today on this issue. I'm just so tired. I'm exhausted by this never-ending discussion about how America is fundamentally, systematically, inherently, whatever words you want to use, racist. It's just, I mean, my God, come on. Let's move off this topic that is fabricated to begin with. America is not a racist nation and was not founded upon slavery or racism, as I've as I've explained through my column. But these individuals, Nicole Hannah-Jones and others, they have a vested interest in a vested interest in continuing this false narrative about America. This is what this particular investigative reporter has dedicated her career to. She's done very well. She's at the New York Times, which is the preeminent media company in America today, the most prestigious. She received a $625,000 grant from the MacArthur Foundation with no strings attached. She can do whatever she likes with that money. Have you ever received a $625,000 grant, Ellen?
No way. No.
And one other point you made, and before we take some other calls, and you were talking about in the Declaration of Independence and in how life, liberty, and the protection of property was transposed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what you're talking about is how the difficulty that our founding fathers had in addressing slavery, and the difficulty in putting a nation together when a certain part of the nation was wedded to slavery and dependent economically upon the slave system. And our founding fathers were conflicted about this. The 1619 Project just portrays them as endemic racists, but that's not true at all. From James Madison to Thomas Jefferson to George Washington, they all talked about how they wanted to create a country in which slavery was non-existent, in which slavery was gone, was abolished, was not a part of the America that they would build. But you're correctly pointing out that the Constitution was a political bargain. It's a political deal. It's a contract among the states, and several of the states were dependent upon the slave system. So in order to create a nation, accommodations had to be made at that time, and that was the compromise. But had our founding fathers not made that compromise, then there would be no United States of America. There would be a slave country in the South and a free country in the North. But the 1619 Project doesn't even discuss that. But the idea from the New York Times and the 1619 Project that our founding fathers were fundamentally racist, and it was in their DNA, and it's in our DNA today, is not only revolting and disgusting, it's just ahistorical. It's not historically true. Our founding fathers looked for ways to build a nation in which slavery could ultimately be abolished. In the Constitution itself, it allowed for the abolition of the slave trade as early as 1807. But Ellen, I want to thank you for your call. I want to get some other callers here.
Thank you.
John from York, you're on the Marc Scaringi Show.
Hello?
Yes, John from York, you're on the Marc Scaringi Show.
Yes. Why, listen, if Miss Jones would call, cut me off.
I doubt she'll call, trust me.
I'd like to hear what she had to say.
I would too.
Why, there's probably a lot of truth to what she claims. I mean, there was a lot of slavery, and we all agree, any moral, God-fearing person, I'm sure you do too, agrees that slavery, discrimination, racism, white nationalism, white supremacy is all very wrong. It's not biblical. It's immoral. It's against what God would want. And we all agree with that. And there was, I'm sure, some of it in our founding, and there's some of it around today. I mean, as a matter of fact, there's too much of it around today. And I truly believe that we should really start working against these things and start working for equal opportunity and justice and hope for all races and colors. Bring us all together in equality.
Well, let me ask you, do you think America was founded on slavery?
It was there. I know some of our founding fathers owned a good many slaves, which was wrong, of course.
But is that why they founded America, to protect slavery?
No, I don't think that.
Because that's the conclusion that I drew from reading the 1619 Project, that whites came to America and founded this new country to protect and guarantee their right to enslave Africans. That's what the 1619 Project wants you to believe.
Well, I don't know. I just wish we would, we have to look at our past, and we have to confess that there was a lot of racism and enslavement and so forth in our nation's early history, and we have to renounce it. And even the way we treated Native Americans was horrible, and blacks.
But haven't
it still
we?
Is today.
But let me ask you, John. Haven't we confessed this?
Well,
I mean, haven't we gone through a couple of 100 years of confessing and redeeming? Do you remember the Civil War?
Sure. Yeah.
A couple.
Well, I wasn't around then, but I've read about it.
You read about it. A couple 100,000 white men, soldiers in the Union Army, maybe 400,000. I think 600,000 soldiers were killed or casualties in the Civil War.
Yeah, tragic. Yeah.
But half of those were likely in the Union Army. Hundreds of thousands of young white men killed in the Civil War. One of the purposes of the Civil War, and certainly a result of the Civil War, was the abolition of slavery.
Right.
Was that a good thing? Were white Americans right to lay down their lives, to forfeit, surrender their very breath with the goal of freeing the slaves? Were they good people for doing that?
It's good they freed the slaves. I'm sorry they had to die like that, but it's good that they freed the slaves. But we have to recognize that there's still a lot of racism and white supremacy and all kinds of wrong attitudes around today, too.
Right. In the 1619,
we have to work against it, and we have to try to love everyone, let everybody know that we're all God's children, and God loves everybody.
But if whites are inherently racist, Nicole Hannah-Jones in the 1619 Project, they say racism is in the DNA of America. So if it's genetic, if it's biological, if whites are born with a race gene, the gene of racism is in our
DNA.
DNA.
Kind of strange.
How do we get better? How do we get cured from our racism if it is genetic?
Well, I don't know if it's genetic. I think it's a spiritual problem, basically. I think if we turn our lives over to God, from a Christian viewpoint, I'd say turn our lives over to Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, or, some other religion, turn your lives over to God. I think that's the only way to really get over racism.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, John, because remember, of course, the Old Testament sanctioned slavery.
Oh, there were some places that did, and that's wrong, too.
Yeah, and so I'm not so
sure.
But now
in the New Testament, I think it was when Christ came, I think it was a little different. He talked about the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
He talked about the woman at the well and meant and talked to her when they weren't even allowed to talk to women or talk to Samaritans back then. And he taught racial justice and equality, and that's what we need to do today. We need to make a country that's good for everyone, equal opportunity for all races, red, yellow, black, brown, white. Everybody needs to be, and that's what we need to concentrate on, I think, and then we'll be able to get over some of these things in our past and in our present. We need to treat everybody fairly and love everybody and see that they have equal opportunities.
I'll tell you, John, that sounds wonderful. It sounds beautiful. It sounds such a wonderful world. And I'm thankful for you reminding us of that. I'm thankful that Nicole Hannah-Jones constantly reminds us that we are racist to our core. And I thank you for your call.
Some whites are, but I don't think every white is. I mean, hopefully I've gotten over that, and hopefully if I haven't, God will get it all out of me. But
amen. Hey, John, thanks for the call. I got to take a brief commercial break. You're listening to the Marc Scaringi Show.
Now back to the Marc Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. And we're talking today about the New York Times 1619 Project. Its creator, Nicole Hannah-Jones, has been invited to call into the Marc Scaringi Show, and we'll have a discussion, a debate perhaps, on the 1619 Project, which has concluded that America was born in slavery and is fundamentally, inherently, systematically, and systemically, and genetically, biologically racist. That's the conclusion of the 1619 Project. We have received a tweet from Nicole Hannah-Jones wishing me luck, but apparently she is not going to call in today. She only has about 10 minutes left. If she would like to have a reasonable, rational discussion with me about her project over there at the New York Times. This might be the first interview she has with an interviewer who may actually question her properly about the facts, the assumptions, the premises, and the conclusion of her project. It's all set forth in my column that's published in the Western Journal and the American Thinker, and apparently is a highly trending column in the country today. So take a look at it and formulate your own conclusions. Who's right, me or Nicole Hannah-Jones? The Marc Scaringi Show or the New York Times? Those are, I guess, the two sources of news that are available to you today on this important issue. And who do you believe? You can check us both out. We'll take some additional calls. We're getting some very good comments from some of our viewers on the various Facebook pages that we have. We have one viewer is reminding us that Time Magazine had to admit the premise behind the 1619 Project is wrong, since the first slaves arrived in America 100 years earlier with the Spanish. And that's from Jamie Reif, who is a Facebook friend. And he makes a very good point that the New York Times has had to correct the 1619 Project's false, fake premise for the entire story of the New York Times is based upon in 1619 was the introduction of African slaves into America for the first time. However, the Spanish, of course, remember old Christopher Columbus, that racist white male Italian. He wasn't Spanish, he was Italian. My Italian friends know that very well. Came over to the New World as it was described back then and started to enslave some of those living in the Caribbean area where he landed. And so we had the Spanish slave trade and the Portuguese slave trade and the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in South and Central America. And they were bringing African slaves over into America over 100 years before Jamestown. We had African slaves in Florida and South Carolina and Georgia brought by the Spanish. But I think the New York Times lumps the Spanish in with the English settlers at Jamestown because in the mind of the New York Times editors, the mind of Nicole Hannah-Jones, the creator of the 1619 Project, Spanish and English are both white. So when she says the point of the 1619 Project is to blame slavery on whites, and so the fact that the first slaves were brought over to the Americas 100 years before the 1619 Project claims they were, I think the Nicole Hannah-Jones and the 1619, they just didn't really, they just lump in the Spanish with the English. They're all whites. They're all white men, and they are all genetically, biologically determined to be racist. And Jamie Reif also points out on the Marc Scaringi Show Facebook that Henry Louis Gates, who is a very well-regarded, prominent black historian at Harvard University, has also written a column revealing that the premise of the New York Times 1619 Project is incorrect. So we have Time Magazine supporting the criticism that the Marc Scaringi Show has brought onto the 1619 Project, and we're also supported by Henry Louis Gates, a very prominent black historian and scholar over at Harvard University. So I think we're doing pretty well in supporting our rebuttal, getting support from some other authorities for our rebuttal of the 1619 Project's premise and conclusion. So we'll take some other calls here. We have Lance from Millersburg. You're on the Marc Scaringi Show.
Why, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Doing a superlative job there.
Oh, thank you.
Right. Anyway, when Frederick Douglass who, of course, was one of the finest legal minds that God ever created, possibly one of the finest minds altogether, was taken to task that he was defending the United States government, okay? And this in the debate, of course, with abolition and all that. And what he did, he answered that with a question. And that was, if the Constitution were intended to be, by its framers and adopters, a slave-holding instrument, why neither slavery, slaveholding, nor slave can anywhere be found in it?
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Yeah.
It's an excellent point, Lance, and it disputes one of the premises or one of the conclusions of the 1619 Project, that our founding fathers were fundamentally racist and they created a country to based upon slavery, and they wrote our Constitution to protect and guarantee slavery, and that's absolutely historically and legally false, as you have just revealed.
Right.
By omitting the word slave or slavery, they made it easier for the Congress to write laws and for amendments to the Constitution to be passed and ratified, to do the work that they ultimately wanted to happen in America, which is for the slaves to be freed and for slavery to be outlawed.
Yeah.
So I thank you for your point and your comment.
All right, sir. Thank you for a really fine program. I never miss it.
Oh, well, thank you very much. You're very kind. That's Lance from Millersburg. Appreciate those kind remarks. And Lance is making a very a brilliant observation, and that is, and if you read the 1619 Project, I mean, they say horrible things about Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, etc. And of course, they're so fixated on the purported sexual liaison that Thomas Jefferson apparently had with Sally Hemings. Of course, I don't know what conclusions you draw from that about America and whether or not it was founded on slavery and racism, but the Constitution does not guarantee, or did not guarantee, slavery, did not guarantee that individual Americans would have property rights in other human beings. There is no such language in the Constitution. And if the legal and constitutional scholars who apparently, and I'll say that in quotes, contributed to the 1619 Project, they reached the conclusion that the Constitution was written somehow to protect slavery. And that's just categorically false. Had it been written to protect slavery, you would see provisions in the Constitution that would say the federal government, neither the federal government or any state government, can outlaw the owning of Africans as slaves. You would have seen those provisions in the Constitution. They don't exist. So the whole part of the 1619 Project that focuses on the Constitution is a total fraud. It's absolutely legally, constitutionally, historically incorrect. In fact, as we've pointed out, the framers of the Constitution, in order to get the southern states, the slave states, to agree to it, only prohibited Congress from abolishing the slave trade for 20 years. And as soon as the deadline occurred in 1807, the Congress quickly, at the request of President Thomas Jefferson, abolished the slave trade. And the 1619 Project says terrible things about Thomas Jefferson, but you'll have to read the statement that he made about the statement that he made to encourage Congress to abolish the slave trade is a beautiful and eloquent statement about the dignity of humankind, of all men, black or white. It really is beautiful. And that's our president, Thomas Jefferson, the slave-holding, terrible, evil, racist, horrible Thomas Jefferson, taking action to get the Congress, and the Congress responded positively to abolish the slave trade. And of course, the white America and white Great Britain were the leading countries in abolishing the slave trade around the world. And we've talked about that last week in the prior podcast. And we talked about how really slavery in forms of indentured servitude are inherent really to Africa. And there are 10 million Africans in some form of bondage today. And maybe that's where we should focus our attention. Perhaps the 1619 Project and Nicole Hannah-Jones, who spent so much time talking about how America is fundamentally racist and how we need to be, I don't know what her solution is. Maybe they should focus their efforts on where slavery actually occurs in the world today. And they can set up shop right in Africa and do the Lord's work and good work right there to free the good people of the continent of Africa. That's about the time we have today for the Marc Scarinci Show. Thanks for listening.